Hi everyone, it's David Kessler. I wanted to come on just a moment earlier so people can find this and get signed on. When you come on, I'd love if you would just give me a hello or tell me where you're from, but I want to give people a few minutes to just find us here. All right, well, welcome. As you come on, just let me know that you're here. Say hello, where you're from. And I'm so glad you're going to be joining us for this Facebook Live. I'm just checking out here, make sure I have my comments on. Okay. Well, welcome. I'm David Kessler, and I want to thank you for joining me. You may be watching this live. You may be watching it in the replay. So even though it may be later, I'd still love to know who you are and where you're from, so give us a hello. So thank you for joining me today here on this Facebook Live that Legacy is putting on. I so appreciate them bringing resources to so many people who are dealing with grief and loss. As you may know, there was a shooting this morning, and they remain so tragic. And I think for people in grief, I've already gotten a number of calls. For people who are in grief, I think whenever there's a public tragedy, it becomes a trigger that you may see someone on TV who's talking about the grief or the loss. And even though your loved one may have not died in a shooting, maybe they were young, maybe something about the grief that was spoken on TV really reminds you of your own. So just know it's normal for these days to be hard for everyone who's dealing with loss. So our thoughts and families, of course, our thoughts and prayers are with those families who are dealing with a horrible heartbreak today. So welcome as you're coming on. We're going to be talking about helpful grief resources today. What's available in person and online for those of us who are dealing with loss. So I'm going to be giving you many helpful resources, but also if there's any questions that come up, please feel free to type them in below and we'll do our best to answer them. So I'm so glad you're here, and I'm glad maybe you're here on the replay. So as we talk about resources, one of the things I like to normalize for people and help them understand, and by the way, I see many of you are coming on there. Welcome, welcome. If you're just coming on, I'm David Kessler, and I'm here with Legacy.com as well as grief.com. So thank you for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about dealing with loss and resources. And many of you may know me from my work in books with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross or Louise Hay, or working in grief, and you may be following Legacy because you understand they have lots of great resources too. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We don't, in some ways in our modern world, know what our great-grandparents knew. And our great-grandparents knew how to be in grief. There was a style and rituals, and you wore black and everything so that when you were in grief, you had people to turn to and everyone knew that you were dealing with loss. In our modern world, it becomes harder to see who's in grief and who's dealing with loss. And we can often get left with that feeling that we're the only ones. And there's not a lot of good models out there for grief support. So that's why I'm glad we're going to be talking today about supportive places that you can find additional help when you're going through grief. One of the things I think about in our modern world is we're a very self-sufficient society. We think we should be able to handle anything alone, and we're just going to white knuckle it and get through it. We weren't meant to go through grief alone. So I think sometimes just realizing that you don't have to do it alone can make such a huge difference. To let go of those thoughts of, I should be able to get through this grief by myself. The reality is, We need other people. We need to see grief in other people and in ourselves. We need to know that our loved one's death has now changed everything. And we hope that other people will see that. The reality is sometimes in this modern busy world, they don't. And you have to turn and maybe do a little work to find the places where your grief is supported. So that's the resources that I'm going to be giving you today. Some of them are going to be online. Some of them are going to be in person. And just know, part of your work in grief is for you to figure out what's right for you. And what's right for your sister, your brother, your husband may not be right for you. So please try to really tune in to what's working and what's not working. And if you find something's not working for you, just try something else. So one of the things I talk about in terms of grief groups is if you have been to one grief support group, you have been to one grief support group. They're all different. I encourage you to check them out, different times, different people. Sometimes you may go to a grief group and just what's said there doesn't feel right in that moment, but maybe give it another chance because it might have just been what was being talked about. So let's first begin. I'm going to talk about some resources that Legacy.com has to offer and that grief.com has to offer. And then I'm going to be talking about lots of other resources that are out there in the world. So first of all, Legacy.com has a lot of wonderful online groups. Let me just mention some of them. There's a group for loss of a child, loss of a parent, loss of a spouse, addiction loss, loss of a veteran, loss of a sibling, suicide loss, pregnancy and infant loss, loss of a family member, loss of a pet, and loss of a friend. So just know if you go to Legacy.com, you'll find those groups here on Facebook. On this page, you will find those groups. And just know that those groups exist to help you, and they are here. Besides Legacy.com, the site that I manage is grief.com. And grief.com has a lot of other resources too. First of all, what you may be interested that grief.com has is it has therapists that you can look up by your area. So if you're looking for one-on-one counseling and want to go to a counselor who is somewhat familiar with grief, and some of them specialize, but they're all, if they're listed, they volunteered and say they want to work with people in grief, you would find that on grief.com, and there's a therapist directory there that you can find someone who's local in your area. You will also on grief.com find grief groups that run groups for free in your area. So I hope you'll also check out grief.com to find those groups that are in your area. And by the way, I'm always trying to grow that list. If you have seen a wonderful counselor who's great with grief, please ask them to list themselves. Or if you've been to a wonderful grief group in person, I hope that you would also list that on grief.com, because I want people who are looking for these wonderful resources to find them. The other thing that grief.com has is if you go to grief.com/store, you will find a store that has movies in it about grief. You will also find all kinds of grief books, not just mine or Elizabeth's, but many, many other well-known and well-loved books on grief. So just know sometimes we feel less alone when we see ourselves in print, when we see someone else is going through this, whether it's a memoir, a movie, or a book on grief. So know at that store, grief.com/store, you can also find lots of different books on grief and loss. Also, if you just go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, literally type in the word grief, and you will find thousands of books. And I always say when you're looking up grief books, you can be very specific with independent bookstores online, indie books, Amazon, or Barnes and Noble. You can be very specific about your type of grief and find a resource. I also have a resource just about the basics of grief. Many times, our parents, our loved ones, our society didn't just teach us about the basic elements of grief. So I put together a free video at aboutgrief.com, aboutgrief.com, and you can find just a free video there that will go and explain to you just some of the basic elements that usually are very helpful for people in grief. Another resource that I put together is for people who have had a loved one who died by suicide. You know, I think a death by suicide, they're all tragically hard. They're all tragic and so hard to deal with. But I think that's one that we're left with a lot of what ifs and if onlys. And I think everyone experiences the what ifs and if onlys. But certainly we do that in a death by suicide. So I put together a 3-part, 3-week course that's completely free. I hope you'll check that out. And that is at suicidegrief.com. One word, suicidegrief.com. So I hope you'll check that out also, and just know it's a very, very helpful class if you've had a loved one who's had a death by suicide. Let me also talk about, besides legacy groups and Legacy.com and grief.com, there's some really wonderful sites out there that you can find online. And I also want to tell you about how you can find some resources locally in your area. So if you have a child who's dealing with loss, or you're concerned about, grieving children, the National Alliance for Grieving Children is a wonderful organization, and you can find them at childrengrieve.org. That's childrengrieve.org. childrengrieve.org. And it's a wonderful site that will also help you, because I think children are often the forgotten grievers, and it's so important that we understand they may be resilient, but that doesn't mean they don't need help. So we want to make sure they have groups and they have resources. Back to suicide, death by suicide, a couple of other sites you might want to look up is suicidology.org. It's suicidology.org. And the other one is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. AFSP, that's AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. You also may be a bereaved parent. I'm a bereaved parent, and one of the places that I looked for help when I was first dealing with my loss is Compassionate Friends. So Compassionate Friends is a nonprofit that has in-person groups in every city. Most large cities in America have a Compassionate Friends group. So you would find them at compassionatefriends.org. So I hope you'll check them out. Those are wonderful parents who have dealt with loss, and they make sure that every month there's a group in your local area to help you with grief when you've had a child die. And just know Compassionate Friends is also for people who have had a sibling who has died. A few other notable sites that I want to mention that may be really helpful to you is whatsyourgrief.com. WHATS yourgrief.com. whatsyourgrief.com. And that's a wonderful site that's run by Litsa and Eleanor, and they're 2 mental health professionals who've dealt with loss themselves and have over 20 years experience. So I hope you'll check out whatsyourgrief.com. There's also thegrieftoolbox.com. thegrieftoolbox.com. Glenn Lord runs that site, a bereaved parent. But all these sites have so many resources for all different types of grief. So I hope you'll check them out. Another great one is healgrief.org. healgrief.org. And one of the things that they have there that's really important is they have a specialization in dealing with college students. And obviously now, just with the news today about so many young people being killed who were in college, That's just a great resource, and that's healgrief.org. And one of the sites you also may have heard about is Sheryl Sandberg's site. She put out a wonderful book called Option B. And so she has a site called Option B that has online groups for so many types of different losses. So I hope you'll also check out optionb.org. Optionb.org, wonderful resource for people dealing with loss. So those are some of the online classes that are available. I also want to talk about how you can get some help locally. First of all, there are mental health professionals who are trained in grief, that if they're not listed on grief.com directory, you can always look them up locally online. Just put mental health professional or counselor in your Google search or Yahoo search, whatever you may be using, and put in your city's name, and you'll often find many of them. The other thing, you can always call your local hospital or hospice for resources on counselors. So that's the mental health counselors. So let's also talk about clergy and chaplains. Many times we have all those big questions about spiritually, why did my loved one die? And we want spiritual support this time. And there's no one better for that than our chaplains and our clergy. So I always suggest you turn to your local church, your local synagogue, your local place of worship. And just know a lot of places of worship have a policy that you don't have to attend that church to go to the group. Now, many times people will say, oh, my clergy at the church, he's great for this, but I don't know how he is for weddings. I often say, in a church, in a synagogue, many times the clergy have different areas they specialize in. So you might even call up your local house of worship and say, is there a clergy member there whose really passion and heart is with grief? And seek them out, because they may be the one in your church that's maybe not the minister you know. So just know lots of different resources there. The other thing I want to mention in terms of groups, your local hospice is a wonderful resource for groups. Now, you may feel like, oh, but my loved one had a sudden death, or my loved one didn't die in that particular hospice. Your loved one does not have to have been on service with that hospice to get resources. So I really hope you will check the hospice in your area out and see what local resources they have, because you'll find they probably have a group in your area that's completely free. The other thing I do want to mention is mediums. I often get the question, should people in grief go to a medium? And I always say, it's not my place as someone who specializes in grief to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't do. But the reality is, people in grief do go to mediums. So, whatever your belief is, you're for that, you're against it, you looked into it, you didn't look into it, not my place. I do just want to tell you, if you do go to a medium, mediums should not be hugely expensive. You shouldn't ever have to be going into a savings account for a medium. And good mediums do not want to make you dependent. You don't have to keep seeing them every month. So just know those can be some warning signs. If you're talking to a medium who's wanting you to keep coming back over and over again, or it's hugely expensive. So one of the things I want to also mention is really when we're talking about online groups or in-person groups or counseling, we're really talking about having social interactions and being seen by another. And there's something primal about grief must be witnessed. We want our grief and our loss witnessed by one other person. We weren't meant to be islands of grief. So I hope you will check out someone locally or someone online or a group online so that you can feel less alone. And one of the other things that I also recommend to people is reading biographies of people who have gone through hardships. It helps us realize while our grief is so unique, we're not the only ones that have ever been through loss. And sometimes the style and the dignity that others have shown or their courage in dealing with loss can be inspiring to us. So sometimes a movie about loss, a biography, can be really helpful. The main thing is, I think I speak for Legacy and grief.com, is that where you get help isn't quite as important as that you do get help. And I know Legacy.com wants to make sure you know you are not alone as you go through this challenging period. And that's what I want you to know, and grief.com wants you to know, that you do not have to do this alone. All right, now I'd like to see if we have any questions. I'd be happy to take a question. And by the way, you can always ask a question later if you're watching this in the replay, and we'll do our best to answer it in print on Facebook or maybe in later Facebook Live that I do. So I have one question here from Sharon. And Sharon actually starts by saying she has two questions for me. She says, first, how does one come to accept not knowing whether the death was an intentional suicide or an accident? And how can I move on past the pain of loss, even long enough to be able to talk about it in a general conversation, to even look at photos without tears and sadness? I'm 14 months past my husband's death and still continue to struggle every day with these things. Work is my only escape. Well, Sharon, you point out a lot of big questions and concepts that I think a lot of people go through. So first of all, was the death intentional or accidental? And I want to prepare you, Sharon. The truth is, you may never know. And I think sometimes we have the illusion that if we find out the truth and why, it's going to make things better. But I have to tell you, after years of sitting with people, people rarely find a satisfying why. And even when they find all the answers, if the answers are possible, they tell me the answers didn't really change things as much as they had hoped. So Sharon, I might suggest to just think about, wow, what if life's going to be about living with those questions? And I also want to point this out. Whether it was an intentional death by suicide or an accident, your husband did not want to die. Your husband was mentally compromised in some way. Whether there were mental issues or stressors in life going on, or other underlying things that you or we often don't know about, just know what we know from people who have had a suicide attempt and survive it. They tell us across the board, they didn't want to die. They were trying to get out of the pain. So I want you to think about that. Your husband, for whatever reason, whether accidental or on purpose, was dealing with some pain and was trying to find a way out. And when I think about it that way, it really helps me go to compassion. And I hope, Sharon, you'll also check out the griefsuicide.com free course, because I think that'd be very helpful. Let me also go to some of the other questions. How can I move past the pain of loss even long enough to be able to talk about it in a conversation? Sharon, the key is to talk about it in a conversation while you're crying, while you're in tears. You know, to me, the goal of grief work is in time, at your own pace, to remember the person with more love than pain. And I don't know how long that's going to take for you, Sharon. That will be an organic process. But I will tell you, 14 months is really yesterday in the grief world. So I'm not surprised you can't talk about it without being sad. First of all, if you loved your husband and it's only been 14 months, I'd be surprised if you could talk about it with just happiness at this point. That will come someday. Gratitude and love may come in time, and I think they will. But sadness is your predominant emotion right now, and I think you got to honor those tears. And just know those tears are evidence of love. And if you've got 1,000 tears to cry, You can't stop at 500. The other question is, work is my only escape. I'm glad you have one. I'm glad you have one. And just know, try to add one more escape to that. Maybe go take a walk. Maybe go see a movie. And I just want to caution you, people sometimes will try to get you to go see comedies when you're in grief. Actually, it helps people in grief more to see a drama than a comedy. So you might just go give yourself an hour and a half distraction by going to a movie. Just incrementally begin to find more and more distractions. Okay? Did we have any other questions that came in?
Kenneth wants to know if there's any body-based things to help with grief.
Yes, Kenneth wants to know if there's any body-based things. Yes, and I'm so sorry I didn't mention this. Grief yoga is a wonderful resource. Check out griefyoga.com. Griefyoga.com. Paul Denniston does that, and he has lots of wonderful online classes. And it's not about sort of, the physical yoga that you have to do. It's more about Paul Denniston, who started Grief Yoga, talks about it's more about emotional flexibility than physical flexibility. And he talks about how our bodies remember. So check out griefyoga.com. And I think that might be it for now.
Okay.
Is that correct?
I have more questions.
Oh, more? All right, sure, let's go.
Lori wants to know if you can suggest a biography.
Lori wants to know if I can suggest a biography. So Lori, I would tell you to look up someone in history, it could be recent history, that has had the kind of loss you have had. So, for example, I think about turning to people if you've had a child loss. Barbara Bush, there's a lot of people who have had children who have died that we don't realize they've dealt with that. If your husband's died, Sheryl Sandberg's book, Option B, that's a little bit of tells her story, a bit of a memoir, but also great advice. But I would tell you to Google whatever type of loss, and I would put in famous people who have had this loss, and then I bet you're going to find some amazing biographies about people who have had your types of loss. And also, if you go to grief.com/the store, you'll also see lots of films that you could just maybe rent on Amazon or on Netflix and check them out. Because sometimes in our grief fog, it can be hard to read a biography.
Aaron wants to know how you can deal with loneliness.
Aaron wants to know how you can deal with loneliness. So Aaron, loneliness is a human experience that we all have. And in the absence of our loved one, it can become very, very loud. So one of the ways that we can deal with loneliness is by the simple act of being around other people. And one of the things that I want to tell you is you have to figure out in your grief who your friends and loved ones are and family members are that serve your grief. If you have friends or family members that are hard to be around or don't get your grief, don't keep going back to them right now because they may not understand your grief. No matter how many times you go to a hardware store, you'll never find milk, right? So it's the same concept. If you feel like my loved ones don't realize what it's like to lose a brother, a child, a husband, because their husband's still alive, their wife's still alive, go to a group. Go to Legacy.com specific online groups for that type of loss. Because you need to find other people. The other thing now is there's what's called meetup groups online that you can just join people who are going to a movie in your area. And I would also tell you, in grief, we quit doing the things we love. So think about, Aaron, what things you love doing. And, your friends who are going, what can we do? How can we help? Say, come to the movies with me. Come to a bingo game with me. Come to this group with me. And just go do something to be around other people. And it will feel very forced at first. But sometimes those are the things we have to do in little small steps when we begin our grief.
Sam's husband passed traumatically a year ago.
Sam's husband passed traumatically a year ago.
And things are still very raw. how do you get the strength to go on?
How do you get the strength to go on? Well, Sam, I can tell you, for me, it is by seeing other people who are a little bit further, who are strong. Sometimes I get them from biography, like I said, biographies, stories, and I'll tell you, I have lots of events that people can go to where you're with other people and you see them who are strong, being on these online groups. Sometimes it's your faith, sometimes it's resilience, and just know that feeling of, I don't know that I have the strength to go on, is sometimes part of what grief looks like. We do feel like we're not going to survive this grief. That is what grief looks like, especially early on. And if your husband died in a very traumatic way, it's going to be challenging, especially if it's just a year ago. So I would ask that you reach out to a clinician, a mental health professional, get professional help if you need it, if it's been traumatic, be in online groups. Grief.com under events, there's lots of different seminars. I have lots of online things. By the way, any of my online events that I have, if you can't afford them, I never turn people away for lack of funds. So just know, with my online events, you are guaranteed a place in them if you need help. And Legacy.com has so many groups to help you that are very easy to access and free. So I hope that helps you today with knowing about different resources. I hope you'll check them all out. I wish I could have named all the grief resources that are out there. There's some really wonderful ones I wasn't able to name or describe to you today. But just know there's a lot of help out there, and you don't have to do it alone. I'm David Kessler on behalf of Legacy.com and Grief.com. I so thank you for taking the time to be here. I hope you'll share this video with others who may be dealing with loss. Thanks so much.